Welcome to today's, the first of our webinar and discussion series for the Projects and Evaluation Affinity team. We're excited to launch this and have our very first speaker talking about evaluation past and present. So your fearless leaders, your co-chairs are myself. I'm Emily Wasley. I work for CADMIS and I am the Climate Risk and Resilience Specialist leading our climate and security practice. Mary is a co-owner of Grounded Research and Consulting and has a considerable background on energy efficiency evaluation. So just to give you a little bit of background on our projects and before I do that, we'll go to the agenda for today. So we're going to do welcome and introductions, give you a little bit of an overview of the P&E Affinity Group and webinar discussion series, introduce the speakers, and we'll have James Arnott, who's going to be giving us a presentation. Then we'll go into Q&A and discussion, and then we'll wrap it up. So a little bit of background on our Projects and Evaluations Affinity Group. The purpose of this group is to expand on the knowledge of adaptation projects or programs and evaluation methods across participants and create a network of people working within this space. So in order to do that, we're providing relevant and informative webinars. We're hoping to share and generate engaging content for phone meetings and webinars, and we're compiling a resource library or a culmination of resources of existing evaluation methods used in the adaptation space and other methods that could apply to adaptation. Several outcomes and outputs include, hopefully we're putting webinars together that participants can learn something new or interesting that they didn't previously know in terms of evaluating adaptation. Through these webinars. We're also hoping that participants leave our phone meetings and webinars with 2 or 3 main takeaways, that you're able to expand your knowledge around evaluation and how programs and evaluation can work together to create more efficient program and project outcomes. In terms of outputs, we're going to have this series of recorded webinars, this one being our first, with discussions with experts from the field, followed by, and this will be taking place on this calendar year, so from March to December, we'll be having monthly calls, and some of those calls will be webinars, and I'll go over that after the presentation. But essentially, at the end of that year, we're going to be pulling together information that we've gathered through the sequence of these webinars and these conference calls to publish a paper summarizing the year's discussion topics and identify a gap analysis. So again, we're going to have a curation of existing evaluation methods as well as a network of experts who are working in this space. So today's webinar topic is focused on evaluation, past and present. We're going to have James Arnott talking about an article that he recently co-authored called Evaluation That Counts, and what we're hoping that you'll get out of this, and James will go into further detail in terms of that as well, but is a description of various adaptation indicators and metrics for evaluation that the adaptation community has been using for some time. And after the presentation, we'll have a discussion on getting some information from you all in terms of how you're using evaluation in adaptation projects, if you're aware of methodologies that you're either using or have seen being used, and sort of what challenges and opportunities you're facing when it comes to evaluation for adaptation. So James is the Associate Director at the Aspen Global Change Institute. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan. And it's so nice to have him on this webinar because he and I have been friends for several years now. He's based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and has an excellent background on adaptation, has been really focusing in on how to use science for climate change adaptation and other societal issues related to climate change. So James, I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Okay, thanks so much, Emily. Yeah, this is great. So I understand I'll get an invitation to share my screen now, and I'll do that. And maybe people can tell me if they can see my slides now that I'm going into presentation mode. Is that showing up as we expected, Emily?
Yes.
Okay, great, perfect. Yeah, and thanks for everyone for being on this webinar. I'm really pleased to get to participate in an ASAP project. I've really admired the effort of all the people in the field that have worked to build out ASAP, and it's great to see that now it's starting to be substantiated with these kinds of working groups or affinity groups, and I'm particularly interested in the work that goes on in this one on projects and evaluation. And I'm excited to present some of the research that I've been doing with Susie Moser to this group. I think this can really hopefully open into a discussion that launches into the experiences that everyone here has had with evaluation and even indicators and metrics, because we're entering the space wanting to really learn what's out there and what about indicators and metrics can be useful within the context of evaluation and understanding this broader kind of framing of adaptation success. So the project that I'll really be speaking to is kind of the child of a project on successful adaptation that Susie Moser has been working on for some time, that has involved a lot of stakeholder-oriented activities, some of which have been supported on the West Coast by Sea Grant. There was a book some years back that was co-edited by Susie and Max Boykoff on successful adaptation to climate change. And that effort really started kind of in the 2010, 2011 era, when I think we were starting to see a mainstreaming of adaptation, but really a need to think more critically about what are we aiming towards when we say we want to adapt. What does success mean? The opportunity that's been provided to us to explore this more in depth with a focus on indicators and metrics has been afforded by the NOAA's National Estuarine Research Reserve System. I'll say a little bit more about this program, but some of you may be aware of it. If not, it's really a diamond in the rough in terms of a set of actors spread across the country that are doing some really innovative work in terms of bridging science and practice, and increasingly thinking about adaptation in coastal areas. And then, as Emily mentioned, this ties into my work about thinking about the usability of global change research, which is the focus of a dissertation that I've been slogging through of late here at the University of Michigan with the guidance of Maria Carmen Lemos and Rosina Bierbaum and some others. So that's kind of where this all, this constellation of efforts comes together for this project that we're calling SAME, which is the Successful Adaptation Indicators and Metrics Project. And the paper that Emily and Mary asked me to come say a few words about is the first paper of this project that was written by Susie, myself, and Kristen Goodrich, who's at the Tijuana River Estuarine Research Reserve. And it's been informed by a lot of partners and collaborators that we've been working with. And just to kind of throw up more of a theoretical way to think about adaptation success that has come out of some prior work that Susie Moser has been involved with, are thinking about the kind of the multifaceted concept of adaptation success. That a lot of times we get focused on the actions that we're trying to implement towards adaptation, which of course are critical, or the outcomes that we're seeking in terms of adaptation. But to start to work towards a broader evaluation framework, some stakeholder-involved effort on the West Coast helped Susie and a team of co-authors to produce a framework that looks at 6 dimensions of success, beginning with the adaptation process, and making the actions, the implementation, the types of things that you actually do to work towards eventual outcomes, and then recognizing that there are a set of capacities that actually support all of these, and that evaluation in a holistic sense would include thinking about how capacity is being built, and also how barriers are being overcome. And so thinking about these 6 dimensions broadens maybe the range of thinking that could go on when an organization is interested in thinking about evaluating adaptation, or in our specific look today, thinking about developing indicators and metrics. But maybe on a more grounded level and just a more practical level, some of the ways that we've been framing different ways to think about adaptation success when we're working with communities in the project with the estuarine reserves, that I'll say a little bit more about after I introduce the paper, is just a kind of a simple three-part framing about, does adaptation success mean developing something better, such as was kind of envisioned by the Rebuild by Design competition, where rebuilding just in the same way as before after Hurricane Sandy was seen as insufficient, that they really wanted to see the idea of how could rebuilding occur in a better way than before. Is defining adaptation success just about preserving what one has to begin with? And this kind of brings to mind a lot of the strategies that are more protective, that try to maintain the status quo. And then lastly, when you can't keep what you've got or you can't find something better, how would you define adaptation success in terms of the kind of graceful failure or dignified retreats that may be inevitable for some communities in certain cases? And so this has been another way to think about the different dimensions of success. But ultimately, when we started thinking about indicators and metrics, we also thought about the communication value of them in terms of being able to answer a question if the president or if the governor or if the mayor came to you after implementing a program after some big event and millions of dollars were invested. If they came and asked, or some other entity came to inquire about, are you better off now than you were some time ago, how would you be able to answer that through a concise way to communicate progress towards some objective? So we started searching out there into the rather wild landscape that is emerging of indicators and metrics for describing adaptation success. And there have been research institutes and NGOs and initiatives of foundations and initiatives of state and local government, a few of which are represented here, that have been starting to develop indicator and metric examples and sets, as well as have started to advocate for the use of I&M in the adaptation world. And so we wanted to explore this landscape further as a start to our project to really understand what was out there, what did we think was potentially useful for us to build into our long-term strategic thinking for the project, and to get a better lay of the land. And so this is the paper that came out of that effort. We looked at a broad range of examples of successful adaptation indicators and metrics, and focused on how these indicator sets fit into some of the mainstream thinking about monitoring and evaluation, and also how they fit into the thinking about science-practice interaction and kind of co-production that is increasingly considered to be an important component of adaptation practice, particularly in the translation of knowledge resources into practice. So what we came up with was a set of 43 examples of indicators and metrics that span the range between 2007 and 2015. And by no means was this exhaustive, but we really felt like we got a pretty good indication of what is out there. And we had a range of different search methods to get to this. We were really grateful for the help of Missy Stoltz and the work that was represented in one of her recent papers that helped us tap into a data set of existing local adaptation plans, and we were able to scour that data set to find examples of indicators and metrics that were actually being developed at the local level, which really helped to round out our understanding of what was out there. So I just want to give a few examples of how we started to categorize these different sets of indicators and metrics, and there's nothing sacrosanct about these different kind of typologies, but what I really like to convey here is just how different different sets of indicators and metrics actually are when you think about them through these different dimensions that I'll go through. And therefore, when any of us in our roles as advisors or practitioners or consultants or scholars of adaptation start to think about using or recommending the use of indicators and metrics, some of this may help to orient us around what is out there and how maybe different resources could be used appropriately for different contexts. So first off, we were looking at who is actually out there going about developing indicators and metrics. And of course, first off, we found that there are a growing set of academic papers that are looking at what would, from kind of a scientific and measurement science basis, constitute indicators of successful adaptation. There are boundary organizations, these kinds of organizations that are neither in the research or in the governmental or in the realm, but are trying to span the boundary between those different types of areas. There are sponsors and funders that are increasingly interested in developing techniques for evaluation, including I&M, that can help to either help them evaluate their work or help those that they're funding evaluate their work. And then implementers themselves, those that are actually working on the ground to enact adaptation actions, have expressed interest and done some of the hard work themselves to develop their own sets of indicators, sometimes in collaboration with other entities as mentioned here. And so of the 43 we found actually the most, this 19, in this boundary organization realm. So that was notable, but this is kind of an example of the distribution that we found. Just as an example here, the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, we count it as a boundary organization because they're really trying to bridge kind of a communication divide between the private sector, development entities, and nation states and now cities in terms of communicating about levels of adaptedness. And they are communicating out to sponsors and funders, basically development entities, those that would go out and try to make decisions about investments in countries. And they have created as probably many of the people on the call know, a global adaptation index, and most recently an urban adaptation index to try to evaluate the state of adaptedness in cities. And some of the indicators that they were looking in the global setting were social inequality, education enrollment ratios. And this kind of indicates that some of the trade-offs involved in picking indicators and metrics really relate to the scale that you're trying to look at. They had to pick indicators that they could find data for with fairly uniform coverage around the world, which resulted in trade-offs, I think, and potentially they would even acknowledge as trade-offs in terms of how close they were actually getting to measuring adaptation. And I think that has been the basis of some of the work and follow-up versions of the index. Another example here is the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of academic advisors that have been trying to provide input to what implementers could use different examples and see who are the developers and who are they developing them for, and get a better sense of the landscape that's out there. From an evaluation standpoint, we wanted to really understand what that were exhibited as far as we could tell in this landscape of indicator and metric examples. And so we used a very standard evaluation framework presented by Rossi, and this is the first part of it is assessing a need for a program, in this case adaptation programs, guiding design of those programs, informing the implementation of those programs, assessing outcomes, and evaluating the cost effectiveness of, in this case, adaptation programs. So we went through each of the indicator and metric sets and screened them for these different evaluation functions. So if indicators and metrics are supposed to support an improved evaluation of adaptation, where were they actually fitting into this adaptation or to this evaluation landscape? And so some of them occupied more than one of these categories. For example, the Global Environment Facility, which is a funder of adaptation projects affiliated with the World Bank, has come up with a tracking tool for adaptation that is hitting many of these categories, like guiding design, informing implementation, assessing outcomes, evaluating costs. And they do it through a range of tools that they have available to them. Again, you can see some of the examples of the indicators, like counting the number of people that have benefited from adoption of climate-resilient livelihood options and looking at the gender ramifications of those programs. I think highlights again the tension of there's a desire for indicators and to put those in metric terms, but the difficulty in relying on maybe only a limited set of data that's available. I think lastly, we looked at how the interaction occurred between indicator and metric development be intended for use by. And this gets to, I think, an idea that is probably pretty mainstream and everyone that's on this call that has been embedded into adaptation thinking about the role of collaboration between knowledge providers and knowledge users and different elements of a larger ecosystem that's required for effective implementation of adaptation. So in this case, we were looking at indicator and metric developers and users, and we had kind of a hierarchy of no interaction, a minimal interaction, a mid-level of interaction we called collaborating, and then a higher level of interaction that we called co-producing. And as we found, a lot of these indicator and metric sets were developed with little or no amount of interaction between the developer and user. They tended to occupy more of this kind of loading dock model of development and making available, but not necessarily going through a process of interaction with those that it was intended to be used by. One of the examples that really stood out in terms of demonstrating this opportunity for co-production was the STAR Communities rating system, which is only in part focused on adaptation, but does have a component for adaptation. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people on this call were actually involved in developing this. This involved participation from local city leaders. It was really led by that level, by a desire of communities to have a system that they could evaluate and compare each other to inform their progress moving forward on sustainability, but also brought in academics and other stakeholder interests in developing this. And they had indicator examples such as kind of yes-no rating systems for whether vulnerability plans had been adopted, and allowing kind of a flexible way for different communities to count what they think what they think demonstrates a measurable reduction in vulnerability. So it provides a more flexible framework rather than a prescribed set of indicators. If you'd like to look through all these different examples, they are part of the supplementary data that's available from this paper. You know, I have been kind of keeping up and recognize that this is changing quickly. Even though we published this in 2016, I'm sure there's a lot of updates here and probably experiences from those on this call that go beyond what's represented here. But our main takeaways was just to first acknowledge that the landscape is very wide in terms of what's out there for indicators and metrics. There's little coherence in terms of what different indicator sets should be used and for why. there are a lot of potential users, producers, and people that are promoting the use of indicators, and this really is kind of expected and warranted given thinking about adaptation evaluation, but that's also just a caution in terms of recognizing that not everything that's out there may be relevant for one person's particular context. And amid enthusiasm for finding good indicators, we shouldn't forget that indicators and metrics still is intended to kind of fit into this broader framework, and so not neglecting a more holistic type of thinking about what constitutes good evaluation practice. And there are organizations like Climate Eval is one that some people may be familiar with, that has written a lot of reports and provided a lot of thinking on climate evaluation, maybe with a bit of a focus on the international development range of things, but a lot of foundational ideas that I think are relevant across contexts. And then lastly, in terms of this takeaway, to increase the usability of indicators, I think we can think about indicators and metrics as another form of knowledge co-production and decision support. And to that end, thinking about the opportunities for interaction, how to think about the context specificity of indicators, thinking about the manageability of indicators and metric sets and the capacities that are required to identify, track, and actually effectively utilize indicators may be quite considerable in many contexts, and so not being naive to that that aspect of them when thinking about promoting their use. And of course their timeliness, how actually accurate are indicators in measuring what they're intended to measure is another consideration. I told Mary and Emily I'd try to keep it to about 20 minutes, so this sort of wraps up the work that we've been doing on this first stage in terms of the paper. I could go into a little bit further about the follow-on work we're doing with communities that are part of the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, but maybe I'll let Emily and Mary just guide whether we should stop and have a discussion about this so far, or maybe go a little bit further into the second phase of our project.
Thanks, James. I would personally love to hear how you're using this in communities, so maybe we can start that off with a kick the.
Okay, yeah, I'll just run through this relatively quickly. For those that aren't aware, the NERS, as it's called, the NERS system is a set of 28 estuaries, and we've been working with 5 of them, 3 on the Northeast and 1 in California and 1 in Alaska. And each of these reserves have been sort of our local partners for helping Susie and I to engage along with the reserves in the communities that they are situated in. And each of these communities are in different ways pursuing different climate adaptation plans or strategies for building resilience. So we've sort of been able to jump in midstream to these efforts and work with them to help guide them in the development of indicators and metrics that they would find useful for their own, for tracking progress in their own communities. And we've had a series of workshops with each one of these, and just to kind of give, we're starting to consolidate this into a follow-up paper, but some of the, I guess, high-level insights that we found so far, the first is that we've, I think, relative to the start of when we started working with each one of these communities, that expressed a lot of desire at the outset for an opportunity to think about indicators and metrics. And I think the desire was maybe motivated by the thought that if they were able to gain access to a set of indicators and metrics, that would somehow make their adaptation work an easier or a significantly more expedient process. And I think that the discussion about indicators and metrics has opened up the thinking about the challenges of evaluation, and that it can be difficult, time-intensive, laden in the values of how different components of a community think about adaptation success, and thus it's not an apolitical conversation. Another struggle that we've had in working with each one of these communities in moving towards a suite of indicators that they would find useful is that so far there has been more of an inclination towards thinking about inventories of actions, so indicators that say whether or not certain actions have been occurred or how many actions have occurred, and instead of thinking about outcomes or any of the other numerous dimensions of adaptation success that we've thought are crucial to having a more holistic framework. So just skipping ahead to remind us of this framework, a lot of the discussion over indicators right now has been focused on tracking progress in terms of this implementation box, but less attention to thinking about the procedural dimensions, how you evaluate the outcomes, or how you evaluate these more kind of contextual factors like barriers and adaptive capacity. And so part of our work is really to try to explore this further, to think about how a community can really develop the capacity to think about these other components that actually contribute to the ultimate outcomes that are desired. Another element that we have encountered is the incentives for indicators, that given that there's a lot of capacity required for tracking and conducting evaluations, that it really helps to have some starting point incentive to get that conversation started. So, for example, in our work in coastal New Jersey, the community rating system, which is a product that is offered to communities for, it's a rating system for offering communities the opportunity to lower their insurance costs through the federal flood insurance program, is one such example that doesn't necessarily provide a comprehensive set of indicators in terms of being climate focused, but provides a starting point upon which additional indicators that are more adaptation focused may be able to be sort of attached. And just lastly, these capacity requirements are very real. The kinds of deliberations that just go on in terms of identification and selection have really blown us away in terms of how slow that process can be. And that doesn't get to the more technical components and maybe financial resource components of what's required in actually maintaining indicator and metrics sets, and then ultimately the question of how they can be utilized to make decisions. Because of course, and this has been kind of in the back of our minds a lot throughout this process, that if indicators and metrics don't provide a more beneficial way for projects or programs to be able to communicate to the constituencies about the work that they're doing, or to guide decisions in a different way or a more productive way than they planned at the outset, then the concern is that maybe all this effort is for naught. So I think I just want to close by giving a little shout out to Missy Stoltz and her work in looking at adaptation plans around the country that we were able to draw from for getting a lot of the implementer-oriented sets of indicators. And this is a set of the communities that they look at. It was about 44 communities. And when we think about this, we're really just beginning in terms of thinking about the scale of local adaptation. We think about the 89,000 units of local governance that are here just in the United States alone, and that includes and is surpassed by 55,000 drinking water utilities, which is an area of particular focus and adaptation. We should think about, when we think about tools like indicators and metrics, really how effective they can be and how to make them effective before they get replicated across all these numerous contexts that they have the potential to be, because that we're really still in the early stages when we put it in this perspective, and want to make sure we're putting our effort into the most usable and useful areas as we start to scale up to that level. So I will just leave it there and hand it back to Emily for discussion.
Thanks, James, and that was excellent. You know, it really gets to the heart of something that I've struggled with in the past in terms of how do you define success for adaptation. And it's going to be different depending on who you're working with, what jurisdiction you're in, but it's really nice to start seeing frameworks that are helpful when it's really necessary to actually develop adaptation projects and programs. So I'm just going to open this back up and open it up for questions. Do we have any questions for James?
Yeah, this is Steve Klein. I have a question.
Go for it.
How are you dealing with this time lag between the potential risk being realized and the adaptation actions today? An example would be sea level rise. In other words, many adaptation actions are being done in advance of the impact to reduce the risk or the impact of that. Maybe the example would be sea level rise. But dealing with that the impacts are out year, and yet the risk reduction that may go on now, whether it's hard or soft infrastructure, you know, you wind up counting the inputs rather than the output or the outcome.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question, and I think that gets, in our thinking, to the concern about too much focus on indicators and metrics from that standpoint that it can consume capacity and to the end of tracking things that are first of all things that are observable, things that are measurable, which is not all the phenomena that's out there, and then things that are happening now but preventing you from maybe thinking about longer term changes or surprises that happen in the short term but that you weren't prepared for or weren't accommodated in the set of indicators that were being developed. So I think it's probably impossible to fully answer that question because I think it really gets to the core here. I will just mention another element of some of the work that we've been doing is how indicators are applied to scenarios and thinking about how in a range of plausible scenarios or adaptation pathways that a community might encounter from moving from the short term into the long term, a very different set of indicators may be relevant for gauging success under one of those pathways than on another. And so, for example, if one of the adaptation pathways is oriented around that building back better type of thinking about adaptation, where you actually, you rebuild by design, you rebuild in ways that make an improvement upon a situation, there may be a number of criteria and associated indicators that you utilize to gauge the success of that effort. But then if you move into a scenario where building something better is not feasible, for example, sea level rise accelerates beyond your expectations, or there's some sudden breach of a barrier island or something that causes a cataclysmic change, then evaluating your success would have to shift into maybe a whole different paradigm. And so thinking that we could have, for any one community, that we could just have one basket of indicators that we use regardless of how the kind of macro conditions are changing may not really be feasible. And so in that sense, indicators become a much more iterative type of toolkit that we would need.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Steve. Any other questions?
And this is John Baldock in Cambridge.
Hi, John.
Yes, I think the question before about the timing of impacts is important, because in a way you won't really know if you've adapted successfully until those future conditions arrive. So it seems like the only way you can deal with it is with some modeling, which is what we're trying to do. So we're using scenarios and then trying to model what happens if we don't do anything, and then model what might happen if we take certain actions. You know, sort of like sea level rise. If we build some barriers, how much effect will that have on reducing our future risk to sea level rise? Or if we change the amount of impervious cover and tree canopy and vegetative cover, how much might that affect future heat island temperatures? But you know, again, you don't really know until you get there if you've been effective or not. But seems like there's no other, I guess I don't really have a question, it's more an observation. It seems like there's no other way to really deal with that.
Yeah, and I think that, like, with just as some examples from some communities that have, just to pick up on what you're talking about, the heat island effect, that you know, communities can look at, and this of course depends on an event transpiring, but looking at the number of people that were actually, you know, attended a cooling shelter during a heat event, and there have been kind of you know, examples of indicators that are more to go back to the framework, that are more implementation focused, like sets of indicators about the number of shelters or the capacity of shelters that are being built. And then, you know, maybe what is a more effective way is to look at the performance of those. So how many people actually made it into a shelter when a extreme heat event transpired. And of course, the limitation of that is it requires the event to evaluate it. So there is that tension there. I think that you know, for some types of indicators, they are going to be event dependent or impact dependent in order to actually see whether they work or not. For some of the indicators about processes and decisions and capacities and barriers, those may be able to be measured regardless of having an event. So, for example, we encountered some indicators about, for example, having the capacity to enforce building codes. So if a coastal community was seeking to increase the freeboard height for new development, an indicator could actually be looking at whether or not they have the resources to enforce and enact that new regulation in the community. And so that would be something more oriented around indicators of capacity that actually support, that in theory or hypothetically support more successful adaptation and improved outcomes.
Yeah.
Can I? Sorry,
it
this
seems
is
like
Beth.
they're. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to jump in and say that I think part of it too is getting to that recognition that we're already in a state of change, and that sometimes saying, you know, what has happened and where are we in a trajectory of change can help us to be able to evaluate whether or not we're withstanding the events that are already with us. So, you know, we think about that with precipitation having increased tremendously already, or extreme storm events are already, you know, having increased, that there is some ability to adapt to where we are. And I would think that you could have a metric for evaluating whether or not we're withstanding current storms and being able to say that this storm is actually different than what we had seen in the past, or the prevalence is different than what we've seen in the past, and therefore we can start evaluating how well we're doing with current changes. And then also having, as I think James was suggesting, that you know, you need to have a range of scenarios that you're planning for, and that you're setting up your metrics so that they are able to capture where are we, where will we be at different time steps.
I know the insurance industry, the way they work, and in this risk reduction mode affecting premiums. In other words, you're engaging in certain actions that reduce the potential or risk, and you are rewarded with lower rates. It could be for theft, it could be for storm, any number of risks out there, and so I think the insurers and the reinsurers have wrestled with this, the experience of risk versus the potential.
Yeah, that the role, the way in which insurers think about defining success or the likelihood of success in surviving an event is something that we would have loved to have included in this, you know, had we had access to the details of how insurance companies think about this. But my presumption would be that there would be actually a lot to learn from the thinking that goes on in that context.
Sure.
This is John again. I mean, here we're looking at scenarios of things that we don't really have much experience with or don't have much of a problem with today, but we expect in the coming decades we will have problems. So like with sea level rise, we're located behind 2 dams, so we don't have any history of storm surge flooding in our city, but we project that in 30 to 40 years that will be at some significant risk of that happening. And with heat vulnerability, we don't have a problem today. We do set up like cooling shelters, but hardly anyone ever uses them. And our thinking about cooling shelters is that people don't really like to go there, and also in the future as heat waves become more frequent and become more longer in duration, that cooling shelters aren't going to be a very good strategy for protecting people because they're not going to want to spend that much time in a cooling shelter. So it seems like there's some caution that has to be exercised about how you define outcomes. It's like, you know, how often people are using cooling shelters might not be a good metric. Yeah. Somehow you need to measure how much people are being exposed to excessive heat, or something that's more health outcome oriented. Similarly with like green roofs, you could measure acres of green roofs that you establish as a heat island mitigation, but I see some literature that suggests green roofs aren't necessarily that effective in reducing temperatures at street level. So it may be you need to focus more on the temperatures and less on the actions, because it might be that you might choose the wrong actions and not get to where you really want to be.
Right. Yeah, I think everything you're saying is really part of what we've been in our thinking. We've been recognizing the limitations of indicators and metrics on their own if they are not connected to essentially a broader logic model about how an adaptation program or an adaptation project is really designed and what it's designed to do, and if there are breakdowns in those linkages or disconnects there, then you could have indicators that are pointing pointing out to you that you may be succeeding when in reality you're not. And in the ways that different kinds of easy to point to objects gain traction in different types of policy and practice settings, I think a real risk is that that they would gain currency, but not gain reliability or validity in terms of actually indicating what they're intended to indicate.
Yeah, that's a very good way to explain it.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Steve. Any other questions before? Mary, did you have any thoughts? Oh, she might be muted.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. The only other thought that I was thinking about is a lot of the things that James has talked about, and the other folks that have said about indicators and metrics are all things that I've heard over time within energy efficiency as well. Mm-hmm. Because you're attempting to measure things that haven't happened in terms of impact. So it's nothing really to add to the conversation except to kind of acknowledge that this is the questions being asked here are not solely the realm of adaptation.
Thanks, Mary. And it seems as though they've been questions being asked for several years. So it is a challenge and continues to be, but I think the more that we hear from folks that are really tackling it head on, like James and Susie and others, the more projects that are available to do that type of evaluation, I think will be very useful. All right, well, we have a couple other things we wanted to go over, but I just want to say thank you, James, so much for your time today and your effort in pulling this presentation together and all of your hard work that you're doing to inform and advance the adaptation community. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Emily, for having me, and also to Mary and Beth, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today, and thanks for the great questions, too.
Great. So for the next couple months, in terms of topics for the Projects Evaluation Affinity Group, our next scheduled event will be a conference call on the 19th of April discussing evaluation strategies. And the intent of these calls are to really bring together experts in the field, but also folks who are either developing projects that and you're not familiar with evaluation components or indicators of monitoring and evaluating effectiveness. All are welcome to join. We'll be sending out invites closer to the date, but here's just kind of a list of the upcoming topics that we'll be discussing. And I'm going to turn it over to Beth now, but thanks all for your time. And Beth had a couple of requests from ASAP that she wanted to note.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Thank you, Emily and Mary, for getting this webinar up and running, and James for joining us. I think that I loved getting to listen to that presentation and the questions that were asked, and thinking about how do we keep advancing in the field. And we know that evaluation is really so much the name of the game of where we are right now, and I love Mary's sort of positive reinforcement that adaptation is not the first field to struggle with these, especially kind of temporal questions, and the way that we solve it is to move through it. So a few thoughts, requests from the ASAP office here. I hope that folks on the call have already registered, but if you have not, please take some time today to register for our ASAP member meeting. It's taking place on May 8th as part of the pre-forum, pre-National Adaptation Forum events in St. Paul. We'll be working together with the Kresge Foundation on a review of their adaptation work over the last several years, and then we'll be moving into more directed discussions on how do we advance some of the ASAP products to expand them and then also move them into action. So I do hope that you'll register and join us. And then finally, if you haven't taken the ASAP member and adaptation field survey, please do so, and also please try to share this broadly with your community. This is a survey that's designed to both inform ASAP as an organization, but to help us have a better understanding of where people feel the field is and where do we want to be in 3 to 5 years. So whether you, everybody here as an ASAP member, please take it, but feel free and please do send it out to your colleagues and contacts because we're seeking input from ASAP members and adaptation colleagues alike in and out of the field. And then finally at the end of this slide is just a social media link. So I would ask for each of you to, in your ASAP member capacity, to take this link and copy and paste it into whatever social media formats you use. And I know that the PowerPoint that you're seeing you probably can't get at, but everybody should have received a PDF copy of this slide deck, and this is the slide that comes last, and I'll also be following up with a text version of all this information. And so just want everybody to register for the meeting, take the survey, and remember to be social for us out there in your social media and your real life world as you shake hands and talk with people. We're always looking to bring new voices to the conversation and new faces into the meeting. So thank you. Emily, if you want to take us out. That was my ASAP office biz.
Awesome.
I
Thanks.
had one question.
Go ahead.
Registering for this all ASAP member meeting that's May 8th, is that done the same time as you're registering for the National Adaptation Forum?
No, unfortunately it's a separate registration. There's no fee for it, but you have to register separately.
And that you register where for that?
If you follow this link, then you can register there, or I'll send out a specific link address for people to
So the link is embedded in the word register?
Yep.
Yeah, so Steve, I'll send out, after this call, I'll send out these slides that gives an overview of kind of P&E working group, but also it'll have the links in here, so you can just click on it.
Great.
Beth, what time does the event start?
It starts at lunch at noon. So we'll do lunch 12 o'clock, and then we'll start our program at 12:30.
Okay, well, thank you guys. We're a little over time, but again, this has been recorded, so if you want to go back and re-listen to it or share it with your friends, please do so, and thanks again. Take care.